Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to the video. So in this video, I'm going to be going back to the NBA and I'm going to be talking about the Boston Celtics. So I have been watching the Boston Celtics taking on the Chicago Bulls. They are currently getting blown out 89-70 in the third quarter. And I'm going to make this video as a case that the Celtics really need to consider moving on from Danny Ainge. I think he has terribly mismanaged this team and mismanaged an incredible opportunity to build a championship contender, and now this team is barely struggling to compete for the 6th, 7th seed. I know they've had a lot of injuries this year, but there's a lot of roster issues that I think are essentially on Danny Ainge, and I'm going to make the case of why this is his problem, and Boston might need to look into getting another general manager given the blown opportunity that they had. So if you're interested in stuff like this, please let me know. I make a lot of different videos. I talk about sports. I talk about NBA, NFL. I make songs. I also react to songs too. So if you're interested in any of that, please like, comment, or subscribe, and let me know what you think. So let's get to talking about the Celtics. And I talked about the Celtics in depth in a previous video that I made a few months ago, so please check that out where I go into more detail on this. But I'm essentially going to make the case of why the Boston Celtics, the way they're performing this season I don't think it's on Brad Stevens. I think Brad Stevens has been proven to be a very good coach throughout his career. He's been very successful in college, successful in the NBA, getting 2 teams to Eastern Conference Finals. But I think I watch this team, and the biggest thing that I see is that they have a few really good players, and they have a lot of guys that are just not reliable role players that you should have on your team that are composing the rest of the roster. And especially for a team like the Celtics that is in a position where they could technically be competing for the championship, and they probably should be based on the amount of draft capital that they had from the Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce trade. They're now in a position where they're essentially a mediocre team with 2 young, talented players, and they're going to be looking to continue to build around those guys. But they already had that opportunity and they blew it. So let's go through the Danny Ainge sequence in detail. So the biggest thing to start with, if you're a big NBA fan, you already know all about this. If you're casual, I'll kind of explain it briefly. But basically, in 2013, the Boston Celtics, coming off of their Big Three dynasty where they won a title in 2008, they realized that this core had pretty much reached its peak. It wasn't going anywhere. So they pulled off a very savvy trade with the Brooklyn Nets to trade KG, Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, Jason Terry was involved, other players as well, to the Brooklyn Nets, and they acquired 3 unprotected draft picks that were huge to the current development of this team because 2 of those picks netted Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, which I'll get into in a sec. But there's the amount of draft capital that they acquired not only from this trade, but from so many other trades where they tore down their roster over the 2013-2014 seasons. It's just so much stuff has been mismanaged, especially over the last 3 years. And I'm going to really get into that, and I'm going to explain it in depth of why I think a lot of this is on Danny Ainge. I think they need to look into potentially getting another general manager based on especially the way the last 2-3 years have gone. So after they pulled off the 2013 trade, they were in an interesting situation because they were still competitive to a degree, and they had some promising players that they were developing on their team. They had Isaiah Thomas, some guys like that they acquired from tearing down their team who were starting to become successful. And in the 2016 draft was really their opportunity where they could really kind of start seeing the assets they acquired in trades come to fruition. So that was the first of their Brooklyn Nets unprotected draft picks, and they took Jaylen Brown with a 3rd pick. A-plus pick. Great job there on Danny Ainge's part. But questionably, they made some other mistakes in that draft, like signing or drafting Gerson Yabusele with the 16 pick. That was a mistake. And then just generally, like, you had 3 first-round picks. I think another one was R.J. Hunter, who they took, and he's not in the league anymore. But anyway, you had 3 first-round picks, and you either could have been an opportunity where now that you have a competitive team, you could trade for it to get a guy that was going to be more productive in the moment, or you make sure you're really hitting on these draft picks. And they hit on Jaylen Brown, but their other picks later on were kind of questionable. But I can't fault them for that too much. They did sign Gordon Hayward that offseason. That's going to be important moving forward in this story. 2017 offseason. So in the 2017 season, Boston really took off. Isaiah Thomas really kind of stepped up as a guy who had arguably an MVP caliber season. But he had an unfortunate hip injury at the end, and then things kind of fell apart of the Eastern Conference Finals, but still very good season on their part. So in that offseason, remember, number 1 overall pick in the draft, they made a very smart trade to move back and not take Markelle Fultz or Lonzo Ball, but they took Jason Tatum with the 3rd overall pick. And again, another A-plus pick, but a series of errors that I'm going to highlight that point as to failures on Danny Ainge's part that he should be accountable for. And the number 1 thing that I'm going to start out with in chronological order is choosing to trade Isaiah Thomas for Kyrie Irving. And they also gave up that last unprotected draft pick to get Kyrie Irving as well. And, on the surface, it looked like a good trade at the time. Kyrie Irving, great player, just recently took the Cavs to help the Cavs get a championship. But ultimately, Kyrie did not fit the system of Brad Stevens. And as a general manager, Danny Ainge should kind of have an understanding of that. And then the other thing, too, is by trading their best player and the heart and soul of their team, Isaiah Thomas, it really soured their reputation to get other free agents and other trades. And again, this is important moving forward because I think a lot of people now, they don't really want to stick around in the Celtics. So we see that going forward as well. So the following season, interesting because Kyrie got hurt, Gordon Hayward got hurt, but still with Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart, Terry Rozier, some other young guys like that, they made it all the way to the Eastern Conference Finals again and almost beat the Cavs in a very close Game 7 and ended up losing in the Eastern Conference Finals again, but still just great job overachieving with what they had. And that is, I think, the single reason as to why Brad Stevens is not an issue on this team is because he's proven that he can take teams with not a lot of manpower to be successful. But anyway, so going into that offseason, everyone was really excited about the future, but maybe what you could take away is that Danny Ainge should have actually considered not running it back. And that's going to be my number 2 strike against him. I know this would be unthinkable at the time, but considering how well the team's chemistry was without Kyrie Irving, maybe they should have considered trying to trade for him. Remember, Kawhi Leonard was available in the trade market at the time. Could you imagine if they had pulled that off? I know that was bounced around as rumors back then. And again, it's a situation where, like, if you were a savvy general manager and you saw what this team had been doing without Kyrie Irving to get all the way to Eastern Conference Finals, maybe you want to try to flip Kyrie Irving as a guy who had some knee issues at the time and also had some locker room questions as well. So, but that didn't happen, and ultimately the 2018-2019 season was kind of a disaster for the Celtics. In hindsight, it's not as bad as this season, but still, a team expected to be a championship contender ended up getting bounced in the second round relatively handily to the Milwaukee Bucks. And then things, I think, really started to go off the rails for Danny Ainge, and I'm going to start explaining it here. So, Kyrie Irving he was leaving that offseason. So Al Horford left. A lot of it was believed to be because of chemistry issues in the locker room. So Al Horford left. Kyrie Irving was going to leave. So I think Danny Ainge made a panic move and made the sign and trade for Kemba Walker in exchange for Terry Rozier. And, Kemba has not exactly been in the best of health, so it is understandable to a degree. But at the same time, Kemba Walker, late 20s at the time of the contract, signed to like max deal. I can't remember the exact money off the top of my head, but he's taking up a significant amount of their cap right now, and he has just simply not performed as especially over the past year on the defensive end. He's been relatively overwhelming, and now he's in a situation where this team is tied to him for a while unless they could find somebody to take on his salary. But I don't fault them as much for that offseason as I do for this. They acquired the number 14 pick in the draft through the Markelle Fultz for Jason Tatum draft pick trade. And the Celtics were clearly a team that, was on the fringe of a championship. They could have maybe flipped that draft pick, tried to get a role player who could help them now, but they took Romeo Langford. And they not only took Romeo Langford, but they passed on guys like Brandon Clark, who would have been a perfect fit on this team right now. But Langford instead is a guy that has barely cracked the rotation, hasn't particularly been effective. And they could have either flipped that or drafted somebody else. That is a big L for Danny Ainge. That is my third strike against him right there. I'm not counting the Kemba thing because I kind of had no choice. But you go through the 2019 season, things were going a little better now that they got rid of Kyrie Irving, and they kind of were starting to move past all the issues of the previous season. But this was a team that had a serious flaw in that they had no bigs, and they were playing a small ball lineup that revolved around Tice and Robert Williams as centers. And my fourth strike against Danny Ainge is that he did not try to address that in that 2019-2020 season. And ultimately, that is why a big reason why the Celtics lost to the Heat is because they didn't have any answer for Bam Adebayo. They weren't physical enough to compete with the Heat, and they lost that series. It was a close one in some games, but they had more talent than the Heat, in my opinion, in terms of the overall roster, and they kind of let that one slide. And then we go to the 2020 draft now. And again, 3 draft picks, but they did not trade any of them. A team that's a championship contender. They took Aaron Nesmith, Peyton Pritchard. Yes, they've been very good, but those guys are not ready to contribute on a championship team, and it's showing this year. The other big strike that I'm going to take, and this is going to turn into a segue, but they let Gordon Hayward walk to go to the Charlotte Hornets. And I know he was demanding a lot of money, but again, a championship team, Hayward is a very good player. So you really have to know that if you're letting that guy walk, that you're getting somebody better in return. And I thought that's what the Celtics were trying to do when they let him walk, which is my now 6th strike, and they acquired the trade exception. But this team was struggling, so they got the trade exception that would allow them to hopefully acquire a big, ideally. But instead, we fast forward now to this season. This team has been struggling. It's the trade deadline. They're barely hanging on to a playoff spot. And yet this team spends their trade exception on Evan Fournier, a guy that is easily a worse player than Gordon Hayward, and he does not address the biggest issue on this team, which is the big man. And again, we see this team getting bullied by the Chicago Bulls tonight, Nikola Vucevic, and guys off the bench, like including Daniel Tice, who was traded there inexplicably for Luke Cornett, who's been ineffective. So you see this trend here, and in my opinion, this is 100% on Danny Ainge, and I think the Celtics strongly need to consider getting a different GM. If they replace Stevens but do not do anything with Ainge, that is a huge mistake for this team. Anyway, so that's my video about the Celtics. Let me know what you think about this and what you think the Celtics issue is as well. So anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you guys later.